So I'm going to make a two-part video. This one's going to be on block periodization, just an intro to the basic concepts of block periodization. And the second part has to deal definitely with block periodization, but I'll try and make it somewhat distinctive, and that's the residual training effect from various abilities. So, first off, there's a lot of videos on block periodization. I'm just going to make it a little more simpler. I don't have a big graphic to kind of show you, but hopefully I'm going to make it somewhat concise and at least explain to you what is the concept behind block periodization. Because even if you get the concept of it, I think it's something that you probably could still apply to your own training, or if you're a coach, really anyone's training if they're goal oriented in their approach. So, first off, again, if you've never even heard of what is periodization, hopefully at the very least you realize that it's just long-term planning, right? And the reason for that is because we are a biological system that we respond to stress, favorably, that we adapt to it to compensate for that. But if you stress the body so much, you get exhausted, and essentially that would be overtraining, going back to the Hans-Selye theory of stress adaptation response. So, the general adaptation theory. So when you think of periodization, the whole concept is that not to overstress the athlete. And remember that, because that's kind of one of the main criticisms to traditional periodization. So when we say traditional periodization, or otherwise known as linear periodization, otherwise known as Western or American style periodization, which is kind of weird because we'll get into that, because actual block periodization actually came out of some of the ideas came out of an American professor. So, but we'll get into that briefly. Block periodization or traditional periodization really works, and they say in a linear effect. The argument to that is really even any nonlinear periodization, which means there's up and down levels of intensity, is still kind of linear, because we all want the athlete to essentially get from point A to point B in this progressive fashion, just with little dips and slopes throughout the way. But how traditional periodization essentially works is, we have these various seasons, ideally for our sport: off season, preseason, in season, and a postseason, in a perfect scenario. And we'll touch on how that's really not the case anymore with most sports and activities, and even competitor or just general training public. But how that came about is that the off season generally is where most of your work was done. And essentially you'd lay some sort of a base foundation. Then the preseason would kind of more specialized training. And then there was some sort of season where you would compete or peak for your specific event or events, which we'll get into. And then you have some sort of logical postseason where the actual athlete or competitor can hopefully have some downtime and recover and start that cycle all over again. What we are finding, and what people will talk about in the block periodization, the proponents of block periodization, I'm going to put a link down below to a great video if you're interested in more information on this, is that what they're finding more and more of is that the actual time for training is getting smaller and the number of competitions is getting larger. So there was already critics on just regular periodization saying for most sports, in general sports, team-based sports, like softball, whatever, any of your team, basketball, football, hockey, whatever, especially nowadays, though there's already multiple events. How do you peak for every single weekly event, or when maybe you have multiple games in a week versus just one event? Let's say like the Olympics, you train for that event, and even that's a bad example, because even those various events have so many competitions throughout a training year. But that's the problem now. We don't have the luxury of different seasons. And nowadays what they're finding is that even at the professional, the younger level, or not even semi-pro, but just youth leagues, are actually mimicking the professional leagues, meaning they're basically having to be on 365 days a year. So how do you make that really specialized for that particular athlete while they're still progressing when you don't have the seasons anymore? Let's say you did have the traditional seasons and you had that luxury of doing that. The basic critique of general periodization is it's not specialized. So what tends to happen is you'll have, just the off season, for instance. Let's take a sport like football, where they need speed, they need max strength. Well, it's some abilities that are common in all sports: speed, max strength, muscular endurance. You could say hypertrophy or muscle mass. I think I said speed, agility, quickness. There's a lot of other ones in there, basically, or some other ones you can even make up if you wanted to. Depending on the sport, depending on the athlete, these are all going to be different. But what tends to happen is either in a I'm not going to say a non-educated coach. It's just sometimes it happens this way, but they'll just throw everything at the gamut at the person. So, okay, we're going to do strength today. We're going to do plyometrics on Friday. We're going to do speed work today, or we'll double up on these things. They try and do all this stuff in one little period of time and expect the athlete now to peak for their season that's coming up. Or worse yet, they do all these things in the off season, and then, or they don't even have an off season, or it's very short. They have a very short brief preseason, and then they just throw all this stuff at them in season, which is not what's supposed to happen, right? In season is supposed to be maybe work on little things, but that's kind of like a maintenance phase in an ideal situation. But the critique is they throw all this stuff at the athlete, and the athlete becomes a really good generalist, and they can't really excel at any one of those areas because they didn't have a high specialized level of training in one particular area. So that's good for a younger population. That model works, just expose them to a lot of different skills and they'll kind of build a nice base. But for the advanced, intermediate, and you can argue again, even on the younger population kind of needs some of this, you have multiple levels, you need to start getting really specialized really early. The other argument is, which is really important, again, thinking that the whole goal between periodization is to avoid stress to the body, avoid overtraining. What tends to happen in that model is that they're getting thrown all this stuff, let's say in the ideal situation, off-season, preseason, all this training, then they start the actual sport, assuming they practice in the preseason, everything else. Now they're kind of really exhausted. They had all this emphasis, and now what they find is generally a lot of the hormonal depletion kind of goes down. Now they're kind of getting more catabolic from this progressive overload of building up, and instead of peaking, they peaked just before the season. Now they're kind of like just trying to get by because they kind of been overstressed that whole season, versus being, just in time for the season and kind of playing it out throughout the time. So what block periodization does is kind of the remedy for that. And how to do it is, a little more difficult and requires a little more creativity, but the idea is that we're going to train for specialized blocks that are highly specialized. Specialized meaning that, let's say, max strength is going to be our block we're going to train. So you're going to train no more than one, maybe two of those abilities. Let's say strength and maybe power in one little block, or maybe ideally want just one. You train just for that block, a highly specialized. We're going to do a strength block, meaning 3 to 6 weeks or something like that. They train that block, and then they transition to another block, and then they would do their next sequence of events. Now, sometimes you can, like I said, how you divide that up and how you maintain it is a little bit different, but the maintenance we'll actually talk about. But that's essentially what block training is. It's highly specialized so that they get max rewards for their max strength or max aerobic benefit, max VO, getting close to their VO2 max training. It's somewhat intense, ideally, and they move on to another intense event where they've kind of gotten away from, let's say, a different skill. All right, so the main kind of, one quote I kind of segmented out from that DVD that I'm highlighting that I think you guys should watch is that high-level athletes need high-level stimulation and high-level concentrations. All right, so that was kind of the big take-home message. And a lot of the big reason for that was because of that idea that we don't have a whole lot of time anymore to necessarily train. So we got to get really specialized at some sort of skill that person or that athlete needs so that they can compete fairly quickly. And then again, focus on another block after that. So now you guys might be thinking, this is going to lead me into the residual training effect, which is really important and something that would save a lot of you guys a lot of time, is that we know the body can peak. We know we have genetic limitations. And if we can figure out what is that, let's say for strength, we have a strength block. Well, how long can you maintain those strength gains once you stop training? If we got to your 1 rep max in some new skill, now we're going to have you stop training all completely. How many weeks would you still maintain that strength you had? And that goes to a residual training effect. So ideally, what block periodization is trying to do, let's say, again, I don't have a whiteboard, anything fancy. Let's say your event is over here. You're going to train a block in this area for a period of time. Once you stop training strength, let's say you can still maintain that strength for a period of time just in the competition. You would start your power block. And then again, once you stop training your power block, you have a residual training effect, meaning you still have that ability where even when you stopped, to still maintain that for a period of time. Now, each ability has a longer tail, basically. And that's what residual training effect has to deal with. So that ideally, we're trying to peak at that sweet spot. where everything's kind of, the tails are still kind of jumbled together. You're not going to have maybe the highest level of strength or the highest level of power, but they're all fairly high at the ideal situation, highly specialized, and not just, you know, all general at a baseline model. So it's just something to think about. The main take-home message from this should be, again, thinking about overall stress to your athlete and realizing that the body cannot get really good at multiple things at once. And that sounds great, but not everyone does that, first off. And first off, if you're doing any kind of periodization, that's better than most people, because half the time you look at smaller colleges, smaller schools, and they're just throwing all the stuff at them as soon as they get to school, or, you know, as soon as they're even in season, and they're just, you know, multiple workouts, multiple practice sessions on top of competitions, on top of life stress, and it's hard to really excel in that situation. So this next video, I'll talk about residual training effects, and maybe I'll have some graphics to kind of show you.